The train's brakes shrieked, a jarring cry that echoed across the barren expanse of Willow Ridge Station, a forgotten speck in Montana's vast, sun-scorched plains, where the horizon swallowed hope as easily as it did rain. Eliza Thornton stepped onto the splintered platform, her worn boots grinding against gravel, her single suitcase clutched like a lifeline in her calloused hands. The air was thick with dust, stinging her eyes, but she barely noticed, her gaze fixed on the emptiness, where she'd expected to find James Carver. His letter, folded carefully in her pocket, had promised a new beginning. A sturdy cabin on a hill, an orchard bursting with apples, a small herd of goats, and a life as his wife, raising his 6 children under a sky that stretched forever. In Ohio, she'd left behind a rented room filled with silence, unpaid bills, and the ghost of a family she'd never had. That letter had been her escape, each word a brick in the home she'd imagined, a place where she could belong. But the platform held no man with a quiet smile, no sign with her name, just a lone boy standing barefoot in the dirt, his thin frame silhouetted against the glaring sun. He was 11, maybe 12, with eyes too old for his face, squinting at her like she might dissolve into the heat. "Are you Eliza Thornton?" he asked, his voice steady but stripped of warmth. She nodded, her throat tightening, the weight of her suitcase suddenly heavier. "I'm Nate," he said. "Pa's dead. Fever took him 3 days ago." The words landed like a blow, sharp and final, shattering the fragile hope she'd carried across 3 states. "Dead?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "But he wrote to me. He sent for me to marry him." Nate's gaze didn't flinch, his brown eyes hard as the cracked earth beneath his feet. "He wrote it knowing he was dying. Said you might come anyway." Eliza's fingers tightened around the suitcase handle, the leather creaking under her grip, her mind scrambling to hold onto the world she'd built in her head. She'd pictured James waiting, his hands rough from work but kind, his children shy but eager, the orchard blooming with promise. Instead, there was only this boy, his shirt patched at the elbows, his feet calloused and bare, standing as if he'd been holding up the world alone for years. "How many of you are there?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. 6, he said. "I'm the oldest, the toddler's still in diapers. We buried Pa by the creek." Her chest ached, a hollow pang that wasn't just the dry air or the dust in her lungs. 6 children, no father, and her, a stranger with nothing but a suitcase and a letter that now felt like a lie. She glanced back at the train, its black iron, bulk hissing steam, the conductor's whistle piercing the silence. She could board it, return to Ohio's empty rooms, to a life of scraping by, alone. But Nate's words echoed. "He said you sounded like someone who keeps promises." She reached into her pocket, brushing the letter's worn edges, its ink smudged from her touch. James had described the cabin's slanted roof, the goats bleating at dawn, the children's laughter over breakfast. He'd written of a life she could step into, not just as a wife, but as a cornerstone. "Why did he think I'd come?" she asked, her voice steadier now, though her heart pounded. Nate shrugged, but his eyes held hers, searching, weighing. "He said you'd understand what it means to start over." Eliza's breath caught, the letter's final line surfacing in her memory. "Come for the children, if not for me. They need someone who stays." She'd read it 100 times, thinking it was just a widower's hope for a partner. Now it felt like a plea from a man who knew his time was running out. The train groaned behind her, wheels creaking as it prepared to leave, its whistle a sharp invitation to flee. She looked at Nate, his hollow cheeks betraying hunger, his shoulders squared despite the weight of loss. He wasn't begging, but his silence was louder than words, a question hanging in the air. Would she stay, or would she be another promise, broken? Her past flashed. Nights alone in a cold boarding house, mending dresses for pennies, burying her own dreams in a life that offered no roots. She'd come here for a husband, but what stood before her was a boy who'd buried his father, and still showed up to meet a stranger. "Where's the house?" she asked, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. Nate pointed to a low ridge in the distance, a faint outline of hills blurred by heat and dust. "It's not much," he said, his tone almost apologetic. "Neither am I," she replied, and for the first time, a flicker of something, Trust, maybe, or recognition, crossed his face. He bent to lift her suitcase, his small frame straining but determined, and she followed. Her steps hesitant but forward, each one a choice she hadn't yet named. The platform faded behind them, the train's rumble growing distant, and with it, the life she'd planned. Ahead lay a ridge she couldn't see clearly, a house she didn't know, and 6 children who needed more than she'd ever thought she could give. The wind tugged at her skirt, carrying the scent of sage and uncertainty, but she kept walking, her heart whispering that this wasn't the arrival she'd imagined. It was something heavier, something truer. The Carver cabin loomed ahead as Eliza followed Nate up the rocky path, its sagging roof and weathered planks blending into the Montana hillside like a wound left untended. The door creaked as Nate pushed it open, revealing a single room lit by a flickering oil lamp, its weak glow barely touching the dirt floor or the cobwebs clinging to the rafters. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood, sour milk, and something sharper, grief perhaps baked into the walls. 5 children turned to her, their faces pale smudges in the dimness, each pair of eyes carrying a weight no child should bear. Hannah, 9, stood by a wobbly table, clutching a chipped teacup like a talisman, her braids frayed and streaked with dirt. Levi and Luke, 7-year-old twins, sat on a threadbare quilt, their identical features distinguished only by Levi's faint scar above his brow, their gazes wary as if she might vanish like smoke. Sarah, 5, peeked from behind a crate, her thin fingers gripping the edge, while Amos, the toddler, whimpered in a cradle made from a splintered barrel, his cries soft but relentless. Eliza's suitcase felt heavier in her hand, its contents a few dresses, a tin of tea, a sack of beans, suddenly trivial against the vast need before her. She'd come for a husband, a home, a life painted in James's letter. But this was no home, only a shell holding children who looked at her like a stranger who'd wandered too far from the road. Her heart thudded, urging her to turn back. But Nate's steady presence anchored her. She set her suitcase down, the thud breaking the silence, and moved to the rusted stove, its surface cold and dusted with ash. A quick search revealed a handful of shriveled potatoes, a tin of flour speckled with weevils, and a single onion, soft and sprouting. The children's eyes followed her, silent but sharp, as if measuring her worth. She pulled the sack of beans from her suitcase, a small treasure she'd hidden from prying hands on the train, and set to work, her hands moving with a purpose she didn't yet feel. She boiled water in a dented pot, sliced the potatoes paper thin to stretch them, and added a pinch of her precious salt, the steam rising like a faint prayer. The aroma of cooking beans softened the room's edges, and Sarah edged closer, her small nose twitching. "Who's she?" Hannah whispered to Nate, her voice edged with suspicion, the teacup still tight in her grip. "Eliza's Pars," Nate said simply, his tone daring her to argue. Hannah's lips pressed thin, but she didn't retreat, her eyes flicking between Eliza and the pot. Eliza ladled the thin soup into mismatched tin cups, handing one to each child, their fingers brushing hers. Tentative. Testing. "Eat slow," she said softly. "It'll fill you better that way." They obeyed, sipping in silence, and for a moment the cabin felt less like a grave, the act of eating a small bridge between strangers. As the children settled onto their shared quilt, their cups empty, Eliza's stomach growled, but she ignored it, her hunger less urgent than theirs. Later, when the lamp burned low, she noticed a loose floorboard by the stove, its edge worn smooth as if touched often. Curiosity tugged her to her knees, and she pried it up, revealing a tin box tucked in the dirt. Inside was a letter, its paper, creased and stained, written in a shaky hand dated the day before James's death. "To the woman who comes," it began, "I'm sorry I won't be there to greet you. I sent for you not for me, but for my children. They've got no one else, and I believe you've got the strength to stay. The cabin's small, the goats are few, and the orchard's just dirt for now, but it's theirs. If you choose them, it's yours too. Please give them what I couldn't, a heart to hold them." Eliza's throat tightened, the words blurring as she traced them, each one a weight she hadn't asked for but couldn't set down. James had known he was dying, yet he'd written to her, not out of love, but out of a desperate faith in a stranger's. Courage. She looked at the children, Amos now quiet, Sarah's hand curled around Hannah's sleeve, Levi and Luke breathing softly in sleep. The letter wasn't a promise of marriage, it was a plea. A mantle passed to her hands. She tucked it back into the box, her fingers trembling, and stood, her resolve hardening like the frost creeping across the window. The cabin was no home yet, just a fragile shelter for 6 souls who didn't know her, but she'd make it enough. For tonight. She banked the fire, its glow casting shadows that danced like memories she'd never share with James. Nate lingered by the door, his eyes catching hers. "You didn't have to cook," he said, his voice low, almost accusing. "I know," she replied, "but I needed to." He nodded, a single motion, and slipped onto the quilt with the others, leaving her alone with the letter's echo and the dawning truth that she was no longer just passing through. The night pressed against the walls, cold and unyielding, but inside the faint warmth of the stove held, and Eliza felt the first stirrings of a purpose she hadn't come to find, but couldn't yet leave behind. The late autumn wind scoured, Willow Ridge, whistling through the cabin's gaps and chilling the air. But Eliza rose before dawn each morning, determined to make the small space a shield against the coming winter. Her first week had been a patchwork of tasks, teaching Sarah to sweep without raising dust, showing Levi and Luke how to stack kindling, keeping Amos's diapers clean with creek water boiled on the stove. But the children remained guarded, their trust as thin as the frost coating the grass. The orchard patch, James's dream, was a barren square of rock and dirt. But the 4 goats, wiry and stubborn, offered milk that kept Amos fed, their bleating a constant reminder of the fragile life they all clung to. Eliza's hands learned the rhythm of this strange existence, milking at first light, scrubbing pots with sand, mending shirts with thread unraveled from her own scarf. That morning, as she strained goat milk into a cracked jug, Widow Mary trudged up the hill, her shawl tight against the wind, a sack of turnips slung over her shoulder. Her weathered face studied Eliza before she spoke. "Town's buzzing about you," she said, dropping the sack by the porch. "Some call you a fool for staying, others think you're eyeing the land for yourself." Eliza's cheeks warmed, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm here for the children, not the dirt." Mary's eyes softened, a rare approval, but her tone sharpened. "Watch for Hale, the land agent. James owed money and Hale's got his eye on this place. If you can't pay, he'll push to send those kids to the county orphanage." The words landed like a stone in Eliza's chest, but she nodded, thanking Mary as she turned back to the cabin, her mind spinning with the threat. Inside, she set the children to work, Nate checking the goats' tethers, Hannah sorting turnips, Levi and Luke hauling buckets from the creek, hoping routine would knit them closer. Hannah's defiance had begun to crack, her hands lingering, on the turnips as if they were more than food, and when Eliza caught her eye, she offered a small smile, answered by a hesitant nod. By noon, the twins were bickering over who'd carried more water, their voices a spark of life in the dim room, and Sarah hummed a tune, her broom swaying like a dance partner. Eliza felt a flicker of hope, but the pantry's bare shelves loomed, the flour tin nearly empty, the potatoes dwindling. That afternoon, while the twins napped, Nate led her to a loose stair outside, its wood worn smooth by hidden hands. Beneath it was a wooden box, its lid carved with a simple flower, delicate despite its age. "Mars," Nate said, his voice soft. "She kept something for each of us from when we were born. She'd braid these into her hair, said it kept us near her heart." Inside were 6 ribbons. Red for Nate, blue for Hannah, green for Sarah, yellow for Levi, orange for Luke, white for Amos, each tied in a careful knot, their colors faded but vibrant in meaning. Eliza's throat tightened as she touched them, imagining a mother who'd loved so fiercely, her life cut short after Amos's birth. She handed the box to Hannah, who clutched it like a secret, her eyes glistening but fierce. "These are yours to keep," Eliza said, and Hannah tucked the blue ribbon into her palm, her fingers curling tight. That evening, Eliza taught the children to patch the cabin walls with mud and straw, their hands clumsy but eager. Laughter breaking through when Sarah smeared mud on Luke's nose, his giggle a sound Eliza hadn't heard before. The work was slow, the mud cold and heavy, but it pulled them together, each layer a small defiance against the wind. She showed Nate how to reinforce the goat pen, his quiet focus mirroring her own, and when Levi tripped, spilling a bucket, she knelt beside him, wiping his tears without a word. By dusk, the wall stood firmer, and the children's faces were smudged with mud and something new. Pride, perhaps, or the start of belonging. Eliza sat on the porch as the stars emerged, the ribbon's colors vivid in her mind, each one a thread of a mother's love she was now tasked to carry. She'd come with nothing but a suitcase, but these children, this cabin, were becoming hers, not by blood, but by choice. The goats bleated, and she glanced at the ridge, wondering how long they had before Hale's threat became real. But for now, the cabin was theirs. Hannah slipped outside, the blue ribbon now woven into her braid, a quiet claim. "Can I wear it?" "Tomorrow?" she asked, her voice small but sure. Eliza nodded. "It's yours to show the world." The girl's lips twitched, not quite a smile, and Eliza felt the ribbon's weight settle deeper, not as relics, but as a promise she was learning to keep. The night was cold, but the fire inside burned steady, and as she banked it, she realized she wasn't just surviving, she was building something, not for herself, but for the children who'd begun to look at her not as a stranger, but as someone who might stay. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from the eastern ridge at dawn, twisting against the bruised November sky, like a signal meant to be seen, but not welcomed. Eliza spotted it while fetching water from the creek, the bucket heavy in her hands, her breath catching as she paused, the cold biting through her shawl. The children were inside, their voices a soft murmur. Sarah humming as she sorted kindling, Levi and Luke bickering over a chipped spoon, but she kept the smoke's presence to herself, unwilling to fracture the fragile warmth they'd built. The ridge was too far for a neighbor's fire, too deliberate for a stray spark, and its steady rise sent a prickle of unease down her spine. By mid-morning, Nate joined her outside to chop wood, his axe swing steady, but his eyes darting to the horizon. "That's no cooking fire," he said, his voice low. "It's too dark, too high up." Eliza nodded, her pulse quickening as she scanned the empty hills. "How often do riders come this way?" she asked. Nate's jaw tightened. "Almost never, unless they want something. Nobody camps there unless they're watching." The words settled like frost, cold and unyielding, and Eliza sent him to check the goat pen's latch, her hands busying themselves with scrubbing pots, though her gaze kept straying to the ridge. That afternoon, hoofbeats broke the quiet, and Mr. Hale, the land agent, rode up, his horse kicking up dust that stung like an accusation. His coat was crisp, his smile sharp as a blade, and his eyes swept the cabin like he was already measuring it for sale. "Miss Thornton," he said, leaning forward in the saddle, "word is you're playing house with these orphans, but this land's got debts. James never paid them, and without him it's mine to claim, or the county's to take those kids." Eliza stepped onto the porch, her apron dusted with ash, her voice steady despite the fire in her chest. "The children belong here, and I'm keeping this home for them." Hale's smile curled predatory. "Sentiment doesn't pay debts. You're no wife, no kin. The law sees these kids as wards, and I can have them in an orphanage by week's end." Hannah appeared behind Eliza, Amos in her arms, her eyes fierce but frightened, and Nate stood at the door, his hands clenched. "She's got us," he said, his voice cutting through the air, "and that's more than you'll ever have." Hale's gaze flicked to Nate, dismissive, but he tipped his hat and rode off, leaving a silence that felt like a storm gathering. That night, Eliza barred the door with a wooden plank, its creak louder than the wind, and told Hannah to keep Amos close, her voice calm but firm. The children sensed the tension, their chatter fading as they ate their thin stew, Sarah's spoon trembling slightly. After they slept, Eliza slipped outside, the smoke now a faint smudge against the starlit sky, and Nate joined her, his shadow small but resolute. "You think Hale's behind that fire?" he asked. Eliza's eyes traced the ridge. "Maybe him, maybe someone he sent. Or someone else wants this land. Either way, they're circling." She pointed to fresh hoofprints near the creek, the earth churned and a snapped twig by the pen, signs someone had crept close under cover of night. Her heart thudded, but she kept her tone even. "We'll watch the ridge tomorrow," she said. "Tell me if you see anything move." Nate nodded, his eyes reflecting the moonlight, a boy carrying a man's burdens. Back inside, Eliza lit a single candle, its flame wavering as she pulled a scrap of paper from her skirt pocket. She wrote, not to anyone but to the night itself. If they come for this house, let it stand as proof I chose these children, this fight, this life. The words anchored her, a vow to hold what was hers, not by right, but by will. By morning the smoke had vanished, but one goat was gone, its tether sliced clean, a deliberate theft that felt like a taunt. Eliza gathered the children, her voice firm as she knelt to their level. Someone's trying to scare us, she said. But we're not running. We'll fix the pen, set a watch, and keep this place ours. Hannah's eyes flashed with a defiance that mirrored Eliza's, and the twins nodded, gripping sticks like weapons, their small faces set. Eliza led them to repair the pen, showing Levi and Luke how to weave new rope, while Sarah watched the ridge, her small voice calling out when a bird startled from the trees. The work was slow, the wind biting, but it bound them tighter, each knot a stand against the unseen threat. That evening, as the children ate, Eliza noticed Hannah's fingers brushing the blue ribbon in her braid, a quiet strength in her touch. Nate stayed by the door, his eyes scanning the dark, and when he caught Eliza's gaze, he nodded, a silent pact. She tucked her letter beside James's in the tin box, its words a shield against the fear gnawing at her. The ridge was quiet now, but the hoofprints lingered in her mind, a reminder that someone was watching, waiting. She taught the children to whistle a signal, two short, one long, if they saw anything strange, and Sarah practiced it, her lips pursed with focus. The cabin's walls, patched from their earlier work, stood firmer, but Eliza knew walls alone wouldn't hold back Hale, or whoever hid in the shadows. As she banked the fire, the children's soft breaths filled the room, and she realized this. Fight wasn't just for land. It was for the family they were becoming. A bond forged not in blood, but in the choice to stand together. Winter's grip tightened on Willow Ridge, the snow piling high against the cabin, muffling the world until even the goats' bleats sounded distant, trapped in a cocoon of ice. A sharp, dry cough shattered the quiet on the fourth morning, starting with Sarah, her small body trembling as she curled against Eliza's side, her cheeks flushed red against her pale skin. By dusk, the fever had spread like a thief, claiming Levi and Luke, who shivered under their quilts, their breaths shallow and ragged. Eliza's heart pounded as she pressed a cool cloth to Sarah's forehead, her hands steady despite the dread, coiling in her chest. Amos, barely 2, grew dangerously still, his whimpers fading to a limp silence that chilled her more than the wind howling outside. Hannah, usually fierce, was pale and unsteady, her hands shaking as she tried to hold a cup of water for the twins. Nate, stubborn as ever, insisted it was just a passing chill, but Eliza recognized the fever's cruel signature from her own childhood, when sickness had taken her sister and left her mother hollow. She worked tirelessly, boiling pine needle tea, its bitter steam filling the cabin with a faint hope, and tearing strips from her last spare dress for compresses. The stove roared, but the cold seeped through the walls and her hands blistered from hauling wood to keep the fire alive. She whispered to each child, "You'll be better soon," her voice cracking on the lie, repeated as much for her own courage as for theirs. By the second night, Amos's stillness terrified her. She cradled him against her chest, rocking him through the dark, her heartbeat a desperate rhythm against his faint breaths. She sang fragments of lullabies, tunes half remembered from a life before this one, her throat raw, as if her voice could tether him to life. Hannah collapsed by the third morning, her body slumping beside the stove, and Eliza's resolve wavered, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She knelt by the fire, her hands trembling, and whispered a plea to the empty air. "Don't take them. I'll give anything. Just let them stay." The snow fell harder, as if the world itself was testing her. At dawn, hoofbeats broke through the storm, and Thomas Carver, James's cousin, appeared, his face weathered beneath his hat, a sack of firewood and dried meat slung over his shoulder. He'd come to check on them, he said, driven by James's last letter, which begged him to watch over the children if death came first. He offered no soft words, only his hands building a steam tent from blankets and a kettle to ease the children's breathing. Eliza worked beside him, forcing broth past fevered lips, her exhaustion buried under necessity. Thomas spoke as they worked, his voice low, sharing memories of James, his stubborn hope for the orchard, his quiet pride in his children's resilience. He told of a night when James, sick with worry, had carved a wooden apple, a token for the future he wouldn't see. The stories wove strength into Eliza, reminding her of the trust James had placed in her, a stranger he'd never met. On the third night, Sarah stirred, her voice a cracked whisper asking for water, and Eliza's tears fell as she held the cup to her lips, the first sign of life breaking through the fever's grip. Levi and Luke followed, their coughs softening, their eyes clearing, and Amos whimpered, a sound so small yet so piercing it felt like a miracle. Hannah woke last, her gaze locking onto Eliza's, and she murmured, "You didn't leave us," her voice raw with wonder. Eliza shook her head, unable to speak, her throat tight with relief. Nate, still weak, managed a faint smile. "You stayed," he said, as if he'd doubted her until that moment. Thomas stayed another day, splitting wood and telling tales of James's boyhood, how he'd once raced a horse across the plains to win a bet, laughing even when he lost. The stories brought a lightness to the cabin, a warmth beyond the fire, and the children listened, their faces softening. As Thomas prepared to leave, he pressed the wooden apple into Eliza's hand, its edges smooth from James's knife. "This was his," he said. "Now it's yours, like they are." Eliza tucked it into her apron, its weight a quiet anchor, a piece of James's dream she'd carry forward. The fever broke, leaving the children frail but breathing, their faces no longer shadowed by death. Eliza sank onto a stool, her body aching, her heart swelling with a fierce, unnamed love. She looked at them, Sarah clutching her quilt, the twins sharing a weak grin, Hannah stirring broth, Nate stacking wood with unsteady hands, Amos cooing in his cradle, and knew she'd fought not as a stranger, but as something deeper, something she was only beginning to understand. The snow outside slowed, the storm easing, and the cabin felt different, not just a shelter, but a battleground where they'd won. Thomas's parting words lingered. "You're doing what James hoped for." Eliza nodded, her eyes on the children, and realized this fight had changed her. She wasn't just keeping them alive, she was becoming their home, their anchor, their reason to believe in tomorrow. The wooden apple pressed against her hip, a reminder of a man's faith and a future she was building, one breath at a time. Spring crept into Willow Ridge, the snow melting into rivulets that turned the yard into a patchwork of mud and stubborn grass, the air carrying the faint sweetness of budding sage. The cabin, patched and sturdy now, hummed with life. Levi and Luke chasing goats, Sarah singing to Amos, Hannah kneading dough with newfound confidence. Eliza stood on the porch, her hands scarred from winter's battles, watching Nate plant apple saplings in the barren patch where James had once dreamed of an orchard. The children's laughter, once rare, now filled the air. But a new shadow loomed when Mr. Hale returned, his horse's hooves thudding like a warning drum. He stood at the gate with another man, both clutching a folded paper stamped with a red seal, their faces smug with authority. "Miss Thornton," Hale said, his voice oily, "this land's debts are overdue. Without a legal claim you're squatting, and these children are wards of the county. We're here to take them to proper homes." Eliza's blood surged, but she stood firm, her apron stained with flour, her eyes unyielding. "I have James's letter," she said, "and a house full of witnesses who call this home." Hale smirked. "Letters don't hold in court. You're no wife, no kin." The children gathered behind her, Nate gripping a shovel, Hannah's arms crossed, Sarah clutching Amos like a shield. "We're not going," Nate said, his voice steady as stone. "She's ours." The second man, a county official, stepped forward, but before he could speak, Thomas emerged from the barn, his shotgun resting casually on his shoulder, his presence a quiet thunder. He didn't need to speak. His stance said enough. "Hales." Smirk faltered, and the official muttered about paperwork, but they retreated, their horses kicking up dust as they left. Eliza turned to the children, her heart pounding. "You stood for me," she said, and Nate nodded. "You stood for us first." The town began to shift, whispers of Eliza's defiance spreading like wildfire. Neighbors arrived, not with threats but with Gifts: a sack of flour from Widow Mary, a basket of dried apples from a shy farmer, a book of hymns from the preacher with a note. You've built what we only preach. Eliza accepted each offering, her gratitude silent but deep, knowing this support was no accident. It was earned. One evening, as the sun dipped low, a girl appeared at the gate, no older than 16, her bare feet caked with mud, a sick infant, cradled in her arms. Her eyes, hollow with hunger and shame, mirrored the ones Eliza had worn on the station platform months ago. Without a word, Eliza opened the door, wrapping the girl in a quilt, her voice soft. "You're not too late. You're right on time." The girl, Clara, collapsed into sobs, and Hannah took the infant, rocking it gently, while Nate brewed tea with the care of someone who'd learned to nurture. Clara stayed, her story untold but understood, her presence weaving another thread into the family's fabric. By late spring, the saplings took root, their green tips a promise kept to a man Eliza never met. She added her name to the family Bible. Eliza Thornton Carver, mother by choice, its ink a quiet vow. One night, she sat by the fire, the children asleep, and wrote a final letter, not to send but to keep, tucked in the tin box with James's note and the ribbons. "If you find this house," it read, "know we were never lucky. We were broken, lost and left behind, but we chose each other. If you're weary, come inside. There's bread on the table and a place for you." The words were her truth, a beacon for anyone who needed what she'd found, a home not given but built. Clara learned to knead dough beside Hannah, her infant growing stronger, and the cabin's door stayed unbarred, open to those who arrived, with nothing but hope. The orchard grew, its saplings standing taller, and the children no longer flinched at the word "Mama," saying it like a fact, not a question. Eliza never sought another husband, never left the ridge, but she carried the wooden apple Thomas gave her, a reminder of a dream she'd made real. The house expanded, a new room, a swing for Sarah, a pen for more goats, but its heart remained the same, a fire that never died, a table where stories replaced silence, and a woman who'd arrived empty-handed but became everything to those who needed her most.